Batman is one of the cornerstones of the DCU. His story, spanning nearly 85 years, has captured the hearts of many DC fans who are interested in the character, and with his next reboot on the horizon, I want to talk about what exactly makes a good Batman movie. Now, as someone who has loved the DC Universe on and off for the past few years, whether it be the DCEU, the Arrowverse, or something else entirely, my heart has always belonged to Batman. He's easily one of the most recognisable characters in this world, alongside Superman of course, and previous movies, while successful, have yet to capture the comic book feel that I personally have been waiting to see in a Batman film. Now, recently we got the news that the upcoming movie Brave and the Bold will be helmed by Andy Muschietti, known for directing the It movies and more recently The Flash. And one of the few positives noted by moviegoers was how Muschietti tackled Batman, and that does give me hope for this movie. Now, despite what various adaptations such as the Snyderverse and Nolan films may tell you, Batman doesn't have to be a dark and brooding character. Yes, that is part of the appeal, but he is far more than that. To many, Batman is a symbol of hope to the people of Gotham, and that's one of the many things I hope Brave and the Bold tries to achieve with this movie. Now, this film in particular will be drawing specifically from one of Grant Morrison's many runs on the Batman character. Now, Morrison's comic run introduces Damian Wayne to general audiences for the first time, which is a pretty huge deal because Damian is one of the many members of the Bat family yet to get a live-action portrayal. Though had Titans continued for 2 more seasons, then I could have seen them use Damian as a plot point down the line. But moving on. When crafting a new iteration of Batman, we need to differentiate it from the previous portrayals, and for me, the perfect live-action Batman lies in between 3 variants of the character, these being Michael Keaton, the Arkhamverse Batman, and the DC animated Batman from the animated series. All 3 of these have in some way captured the essence of what Batman should be as a character, someone motivated by his tragedy using his skills and knowledge to protect his city. Now, with the introduction of Damian in this movie, this also gives us the added bonus of seeing a live-action Bat family on screen. We've gotten the 3 Robins courtesy of Titans and Batwoman courtesy of the Arrowverse, but the CW wasn't allowed to use Batman as a character. They alluded to him, sure, but he was never seen on screen as part of the story. But with this new DCU, we finally have a chance to see Batman and the Bat family all on screen together, which is literally just incredible to think about here. Now, you'll actually notice that I haven't mentioned one certain portrayal of the Dark Knight so far up to this point, but I am going to bring him up now. Matt Reeves' Batman movie was nothing short of spectacular. It was a noir-driven detective story that finally gave the Batman character the love and attention he deserved after all this time. Now, James Gunn has said on more than one occasion, I believe, that Reeves will be allowed to continue his story with his Batman, while the main DCU will feature their own variant of the character, which I think is a very smart move, because they could have easily brought that movie and its associated universe into the new canon, but Gunn is allowing Reeves and his team to have that creative freedom as part of the DC Elseworlds label, and I really respect that. Now, while I absolutely loved how Robert Pattinson portrayed Bruce in this movie, it's more of an experimental portrayal, because he's not yet the established hero we know him as. Now, I have discussed at length my thoughts on Pattinson's Batman, along with some other ideas like sequels and whatnot, So go and check out the many videos I made on that movie on the channel, so there'll either be links in the description or in the sidebar thing. Now, when looking at a villain for this movie, that might be one of the most difficult decisions that any filmmaker / director has actually had to make if they're one of the few people chosen to actually direct a Batman movie. Tim Burton chose rogues like Joker, Catwoman and the Penguin, while Nolan chose others like Scarecrow, Bane and Two-Face, just to name a few. However, the important thing we need to keep in mind is Damian. With his inclusion in this reboot, then I think it's time that Ra's al Ghul and the League of Assassins got their time in the spotlight. Now, we did of course get Ra's and Talia in the Nolan films, but it's been over 10 years since we've seen them on film, so I think it would be a good shout to have them come back in this movie. I am aware of other portrayals in Gotham and the Arrowverse, but those are purely TV portrayals, so I'm focusing solely on film here. Now, in various iterations of the DC Universe, the League of Assassins are located in Nanda Parbat, to the best of my knowledge. However, I think it would be really cool to see Ra's and the League in Brave and the Bold having a background in Japanese culture. Now, I have nothing against the other cultures they're a part of in other iterations of the League in the comics, but I've always loved the idea of Ra's al Ghul leading a cult of samurai warriors, plus a lot of martial arts that Batman studied to protect Gotham have their roots in Japanese teachings, at least to my knowledge. But with Damian being introduced, we of course need to include Talia. Now, how Damian's conception would work regarding the timeline is fairly simple actually. Have flashbacks to Bruce and Talia when Bruce first seeks out Ra's and the League to learn their teachings, and we can see Bruce and Talia slowly growing affectionate for each other. Now, in the comics, Damian's conception is a little unusual to say the least, as he was grown in some kind of artificial womb to spare Talia the labours of pregnancy. Now, alongside Ra's and Talia, I would love to see Deathstroke appear as well, because not only is Slade Wilson a formidable opponent, but a war veteran studying ancient forms of combat is just plain badass in my opinion, although I think I've heard that story before. Okay, we've talked about these characters at length, so let's actually cast them now, shall we? Now, I'm going to keep things to a minimum and cast the following characters: Batman, Alfred, Damian, Ra's al Ghul, Talia, Deathstroke, Nightwing and Tim Drake. Now, while I am open to seeing more members of the Bat family like Barbara Gordon or Jason Todd showing up, I'm going to keep things to a minimum for now, but drop your thoughts on who you'd cast as these characters in the comments below. So, I'll be going through a couple of the easy castings to begin with, then I'll get to the ones that I feel need a little more explaining. Now, onto the characters that need a little more explanation. Starting off with Ra's al Ghul, I've cast Hiroyuki Sanada. This to me is a really good idea because, as mentioned, I've always loved the idea of Ra's and the League having a background in Japanese mythology, so that's mainly why I've cast him in the role. And moving on to Talia, her role was very tricky to cast, but after a lot of searching I've landed on Elodie Young. You'll know her for her work on the Daredevil Netflix series where she played Elektra, and she has a very combat-heavy role on that show. Also, on a side note, shout out to my friend Alex who loves Daredevil. Now, moving on to Damian, this casting for me is at least a no-brainer, because I've stood by this for quite a while now, and I'm sure a lot of people have as well, but I believe that Aidan Gallagher would be a pretty kick-ass Damian in my opinion. Now, Gallagher is no stranger to superhero roles, having played the role of Number 5 in Netflix's Umbrella Academy since the show's first season. I need to get to that show because people have just told me it looks really good. And finally, we come down to our new Batman. You all know where I'm going with this, and I hope you can all stand with me on this, but my fan cast for the new DCU Batman is Jensen Ackles. This guy was made for this role, he's a huge fan of Batman, plus he's supposedly on a shortlist to play the character, and believe me, he has to beat out everyone else on that list, though it probably won't be that difficult, will it? Let's be honest here. Now, the story in terms of what we're looking at here is very difficult to tackle, but I think I've got a pretty good idea in mind for this. So the story will take place a few months into Damien's time as Robin, but we see flashbacks to Bruce discovering the truth about Damien, him training with Ra's before he became Batman, along with his relationship during that period with Talia, which led to Damien's conception. By the end of Act 1, Talia has arrived in Gotham and tells Bruce that she wants Damien to come home now, and Bruce of course refuses, and Talia says, so be it. And Act 2 will focus on Talia's attempts to take down Bruce by sending Deathstroke after him because, well, if there's a man dressed like a bat stopping you from seeing your son, you gotta hire an assassin. Maybe. I don't know how that works. Now, eventually, Damien is actually the one to incapacitate Slade, which ends with the assassin losing his eye. Now, depending on which canon we're looking at, Slade has lost his eye in various circumstances, but in, I believe, the Son of the Batman animated film, Slade loses his eye thanks to Damien. I'm not sure how accurate that is, so don't quote me on that. Act 3 will shift focus onto Bruce and Damien versus Ra's and Talia. Our heroes will of course emerge victorious, with Damien fatally injuring the head of the League. Talia decides to allow Damien to stay with his father, but promises Bruce that one day the Great White Ra's al Ghul will return to claim his heir.
When people go to see a movie, I hope that when they go to see a movie, they walk in, they enjoy it, of course, and then when they walk out of the theater, they love the person next to them a little more than what they felt about them when they walked in. That when they walk out of the theater, maybe they feel a little bit more hopeful about what this world can be than when they walked in. This is a story about compassion. It's about the power of compassion, the power of empathy, and hopefully a little bit of that will soak up, just a little bit in people, and then we'll have been, done what we need to do.
We need a Superman movie. For years now, the character has been mistreated by DC, relegating him to no more than faceless cameos, quick mentions, and pointless end credit scenes. But like a lot of people, I do believe that a Superman movie is necessary, because in a world where cynicism and hate speech run rampant across the masses, I think that Superman is the one figure that can keep that from rising. A hopeful, optimistic character who believes in the good of humanity. And with Superman Legacy, I think we finally have a chance to see what a good Superman film can truly accomplish. Now, when talking about a Superman movie, we first need to talk about what makes a good one, like I did in my Batman video. Now, this is going to be difficult to discuss, seeing as we haven't had a live-action Superman film in over 10 years now, and the movies, while not all terrible, haven't really captured what Superman should truly be. However, I think the answer to this question lies with Superman and Lois, a TV show that demonstrates what Superman as a character can really accomplish when given the chance. Tyler Hoechlin is what a cinematic Superman truly needs to aspire to. Someone who stands up for the people of Earth to fight for what is actually right. And Superman represents hope to everyone, no matter what walk of life they come from. They can just look up to the sky and see a man in a red cape with an S on his chest saving the day. Now, a Superman movie I feel is necessary because since 2017 he's been pushed to the sidelines for far too long, and by the time he returned in Black Adam, the damage was done and Cavill was out. Now, there's a lot of people who are really hating on James Gunn for a lot of this, but are we forgetting that all the stuff James has had a hand in bringing to the big screen? The Suicide Squad in recent memory is a brilliant take on the team of villains and is way better than the 2016 version. Also, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is fucking incredible. That movie alone made me start to like Marvel again after a lot of the disappointing stuff from the MCU recently. Now, Superman, much like Batman, has a very infamous rogues gallery, with names like Metallo, Bizarro, and Doomsday all coming to mind. Now, we know Lex Luthor will be in the movie, seeing as there are currently screen tests going on for the character, but I don't think he'll serve the role of an antagonist, at least in the first movie. I feel, personally, that role should instead go to Brainiac. Now, some people may argue that Brainiac is more of a Justice League villain, like Darkseid, more as a Superman villain, and I can understand where certain people come from. But Brainiac to me is a very fascinating character because he's a collector of worlds, and his main goal is to catalogue every civilization in the universe just out of pure curiosity. Now, when looking at Brainiac in popular media such as films and television, I would love to see Brainiac have ties to Krypton. In Superman the Animated Series, he originally was created as a supercomputer until he decided to explore the universe. Something like that is very reminiscent of Skynet from the Terminator films, and I would love to see something like that used for this film in particular. Now, the casting for this is going to be tricky, as we don't know what characters are going to appear in the movie. Now, from what James Gunn has said so far, other than Clark and Lois, we will be seeing Lex Luthor, Jimmy Olsen, and Krypto the Superdog. I would also be willing to bet that we'll see Supergirl in this movie, not playing a huge role, but maybe in a flashback to show Clark leaving Krypton and then being separated, and then a post-credit scene to set up her solo movie. Also, please bring Sasha Cally back as Kara. She needs to come back for that movie in particular. But I'm going to be casting some of the characters that I think we'll be seeing in this movie, and these are Lex Luthor, Jimmy Olsen, Jor-El, Jonathan Kent, Martha Kent, Brainiac, and Perry White. Alongside that, I want to go into my thoughts very quickly on the new actors playing Superman and Lois as well, but I'll save that for after I've gone through the other characters. So starting off with some of the characters that need very little explanation. For Perry White, I've gone for Bruce Campbell. For Jimmy Olsen, it's Noah Schnapp. For Jor-El, it's Anson Mount. And for Jonathan and Martha Kent, I've gone for Josh Duhamel and Winona Ryder. Now, moving on to the ones that need more of an explanation, I'll first be starting with Lex Luthor, which is a mixed bag for me because I personally am unsure of how old Lex is going to be for a story like this, especially with a younger Superman at the forefront of the film. Now, there are loads of actors out there who could play Lex very well. For Superman Legacy, I've seen Nicholas Holt's names thrown around, which I'm unsure on, to be honest. Also, I kind of feel sorry for him because he's lost out on the roles of both Batman and Superman now. Then there's the Skarsgård brothers, Bill and Alexander, who I have seen very little of in film to judge as actors. However, for me, the role of Lex Luthor should go to either Mark Strong or Bryan Cranston. Strong, I feel, is around that age to play Lex for a movie focusing on a younger Superman, and I could see him and David Corenswet's version of Clark having a friendship of some kind, very much like Tom Welling and Michael Rosenbaum's characters in Smallville. Bryan Cranston, however, is a different story. While he may be older, it's Walter White, among other things, that sold me on this particular fan cast, but I personally am torn between these two actors for the role. For Brainiac, that is also a challenge, because I imagine him being mostly CGI or very similar to The Vision, where he's a practical effects and CGI hybrid character, which I certainly hope is the case. Now for Brainiac, I'll actually cast Christopher Eccleston. Now the Doctor Who fans among you might be yelling at your screens now, but just hear me out. Brainiac is meant to be an intelligent mind amongst the lesser masses. Then just look at the Ninth Doctor and imagine him as a villain. To me, that's Brainiac. That's a villain who would go around the world cataloguing the brightest cities in the world for his own collection. And now we come to my thoughts on the new Superman and Lois. I personally am very happy with Gunn's decision. Whilst I would have loved Emma Mackey to get the role of Lois, I think Rachel Brosnahan will do an excellent job, and I've been behind the fan cast of Corenswet as Superman for some time now, and I've realised at this moment why people were fan casting him, and to me he looked like a cross between Henry Cavill and Tom Welling, which I think is a very good thing. So we've talked about what makes a good Superman movie, we've talked about the villain that would be most ideal, and we've talked about the cast. But what about the story? Now I think Superman Legacy should follow the story model of the hero's journey. Now for those who don't know, the hero's journey in writing terms is a story structure that follows a hero going on an adventure, coming back as a changed person. Now since this movie is focusing on Clark trying to balance his human and Kryptonian heritage, I think that should be the overall goal for this movie. We can see Clark over the course of this movie making a difference in Metropolis, stopping major crimes, and helping the minorities in this world. We can also see him meet Lex Luthor for the first time, or we can go down the Smallville route and have Clark and Lex already be very good friends. However, we also need to follow a 3-act structure for this movie. Act 1 should introduce us to this version of Clark and set up his conflicts for the movie, as we see him balancing his life at the Daily Planet along with his life as Superman at the end of the first part of the story. could see Brainiac's introduction. Act 2 can see Clark journey to the Fortress of Solitude, where we see Jor-El explain who Brainiac is, that he originally was created as a supercomputer until he decided to leave Krypton to learn about and catalogue the wider universe, and that's how Krypton was destroyed, that Brainiac had returned to the planet and catalogued its brightest city, Kandor. And then Act 3 will be the big finale, as we see Superman defeat Brainiac in a bid to protect his home. In the final battle, which will cause a lot of property damage, this is after all a superhero movie, but after all that, we see Clark defeat Brainiac, telling him that Earth is protected, and if he ever returns then he'll see to it that he never makes a plan to come back.
That moves directly into The Flash, a fantastic movie that I really love that resets the entire DC universe.
Ah! Good God! It's hideous, but beautiful in an ugly way. But mostly hideous. Ugh.
The Flash is one of the greatest heroes in the DC universe. He has such a rich history that loads of people can become attached to, and his adventures on the CW have quote-unquote captivated an entire audience of fans. But with the recent Flash movie doing more harm than good for the studio, I wanted to take a look at how a proper Flash movie should actually be made. Now, before we can actually pitch a good Flash movie, we first need to look back at the character's history in film and some television to determine what was good and bad about them in order to make sure those mistakes aren't repeated. And where else to start than the Arrowverse? Now, the Flash's reputation on the CW is mixed at best, because the show has been, for many people, declining in quality. If you watched my video on Gotham Knights quite a while ago, then you'll know I said things for the Flash deteriorated to the point of that looking like Power Rangers. However, not that everything from that show is terrible, because Grant Gustin is terrific as Barry Allen, especially in the earlier seasons of the show. Not only that, but some of the recurring villains are simply amazing to watch on screen. Teddy Sears' version of Zoom and Tommy Cavanagh's Eobard Thawne are some of the Arrowverse's best villains in my opinion. But other noteworthy ones include Wentworth Miller's Captain Cold, Dominic Purcell's Heatwave, both of which are beloved characters by many fans, especially once they became regulars on Legends of Tomorrow. And now I'll get to talking about more villains a bit later on, but right now let's move on to something else.
If I can't get back, there might not be a future.
But now we move on to Barry Allen's most recent appearance, the 2023 Flash movie, which adapted the comic storyline Flashpoint. Loosely, I might add. Now, I have already talked about the movie in my video where I made some very necessary changes, such as replacing Keaton's Batman with Jeffrey Dean Morgan's Thomas Wayne, and replacing Dark Flash with Eobard Thawne. If you want to see what I changed in depth, then go and check out that video, because I don't really want to go over everything again, but just go and check out the video. But despite all the glaring flaws this movie has, there are some diamonds in the rough. For one thing, many people enjoyed Sasha Calle's Supergirl, and I myself hope she has a future as the character in James Gunn's new DC universe. Others enjoyed the performances of Keaton and Affleck's respective versions of Batman. I also think that some of the action in this film as well is very well executed, especially when it came to Keaton's Batman. It's very Arkham-esque, and I mentioned that in another video. So what exactly can we take from this movie? Well, a few things, with these being, number 1, there are more Flash stories to adapt than Flashpoint. Secondly, other DC characters appearing in cameo roles is okay to a certain degree. Number 3, Batman is always a plus, and number 4, don't keep the movie in development hell like this one. And now we move on to the Justice League animated series from the early 2000s, which I feel obligated to talk about for a few reasons. The first being that the new DC universe is supposedly based on the animated universe this show comes from, and the second being we have a different Flash in the form of Wally West. Now, I'm not the first one to point this out, obviously, but I think after this movie and the conclusion to the TV show, we really need a break from Barry as the Flash. Now, I don't have a problem with him showing up in any way, but after the movie and the TV show, I think we need a break from Barry as a character. So I think it's time that Wally West got the spotlight now. In the comics, Wally becomes the Flash, and arguably is a better version than Barry Allen, and I would love to see that proven. So we've got our Flash, but now what do we do with him? Now the Flash, in my opinion, has one of the better libraries of villains in DC Comics, with the Rogues, Gorilla Grodd, and of course Eobard Thawne. But I would love to see Wally going up against a team of the Rogues. Now the team in the comics features various members. Captain Cold and Heatwave are arguably two of the better shouts, but we've had them in the TV show, and Captain Cold was originally meant to be in a draft of the script written by Grant Morrison and Ezra Miller, if I remember correctly, where it sounded like a much better version of the movie, but I'll get to that a bit later on. However, the one thing we need to do with Wally as the Flash is differentiating him from Barry Allen. The Arrowverse took a majority of Wally's stories, such as his powers and even his girlfriend, and gave them to Barry, which I can understand because Wally was the Flash from 1986 to like 2009, and Barry didn't get any major storylines until Jeff Johns wrote Flashpoint. And that's another point I want to bring up, because I find it lazy how WB just went to adapt Flashpoint, because there's loads of fantastic Flash storylines out there. Rogue War, Nobody Dies, Blitz, Born to Run, Lightning Strikes Twice, and Rebirth, which reintroduced Barry Allen. My point is, the comic where Barry goes back in time to save his mother isn't the only noteworthy Flash storyline. As I mentioned at the start, he has such a rich history that loads of people can become attached to. The Speed Force, Bart Allen, the Flash family, and the Rogues. The Flash has so much potential that the Arrowverse and the recent movie have in many ways squandered, but there are versions of the movie we never got to see, so let's actually pivot over to them for a minute. Now, as we all know, the Flash movie was stuck in deep development hell for years on end, with directors and writers signing on and then dropping off faster than people died during COVID. With noteworthy names including Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who then left to work on Solo, which they got fired from, and then wrote Spider-Verse. Rick Famuyiwa is another name that was involved at one point, and even Grant Morrison was in the mix as well. Now, the two scripts I'm going to talk about are what I was able to find. These are Rick Famuyiwa's version of the movie and the script written by Grant Morrison and Ezra Miller. Now we'll start off with Miller and Morrison's script first, seeing as I've already brought them up. Now in March 2019, Ezra Miller and Grant Morrison submitted a very detailed script for the Flash movie, which sadly didn't end up being used for the film, as it sounds much better than what we got. The movie would have featured Captain Cold, Mirror Master and Golden Glider as the villains, and Ezra was interested in having Ray Fisher's Cyborg in the movie, but Grant was hesitant against that, reasoning that the first Flash movie should be a solo outing, which I can kind of understand. However, Rick Famuyiwa's version of the Flash movie sounded really promising as well. This movie would have, unlike the previous script draft, featured Ray Fisher's Cyborg in a prominent role, and the villains would have been the Rogues, with Captain Cold and Golden Glider being mentioned from the research I was able to find. There was also a subplot about Barry trying to prove that a reformed criminal was framed for a murder he didn't commit, and exposing corrupt cops who had been fabricating evidence for years, including the case of Barry's father and Barry's mother being killed. Iris West helps Barry expose the corrupt cops because her brother was also framed and died in prison, and she bonds with Barry over losing people to the corrupt system. She knows about Barry's powers from the start, and after he saved her in Justice League, and is the one who named him the Flash. Both of these versions of the script arguably sound much better than the movie that was released, and it brings me back to Flashpoint. It isn't the only noteworthy Flash storyline that can be adapted. And now we come to the Flash villains, and as mentioned, the character, whether it be Jay Garrick, Wally West or Barry Allen of course, all have a brilliant rogues gallery that have yet to make their big screen debut. But if we're talking about Barry Allen, he's faced some pretty big villains over the years. Reverse Flash, Gorilla Grodd, The Thinker, Captain Cold, all these villains are instrumental to the Scarlet Speedster's history, and they all deserve their time in the spotlight. But talking about Wally, I believe the DC Studios would go for a trilogy, with the first being about Wally perhaps fighting the Rogues, then the second being a story set in Gorilla City, with the third being about Wally finally becoming the hero in a big fight with one of the major speedsters, or even The Thinker, which would add a nice twist onto things, because in my eyes, Eobard Thawne is Barry Allen's greatest enemy, and The Thinker is known more as one of Wally's greatest enemies. Plus, they did do the Thinker to some respect on the TV show, but I think we need a different take on him now, especially after what Peter Capaldi did with the character in the Suicide Squad. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's cast some characters. Now, before I get to casting, I want to briefly touch on this point real quick. Now, this isn't about what powers I think Wally will have, because I think he'll gradually develop them over the course of the movie, but this is about how the movie hypothetically would present the speedster powers on screen. This is something that the CW and the recent movie have gotten some criticism for, and I would love to see something different. Now, a movie that actually depicts speedster powers in a really good way was The Eternals, with Lauren Ridloff's character Makari, and I think something like that, combined with the earlier CW Flash running in the mix, is what we need for something that becomes more unique to Wally West as a character. Now, before I get into that, I first need to give a rundown of the characters that would appear in a Wally West Flash movie. Now, this is my personal opinion, but here are the characters I would plan to cast. So, of course, I'd go with the Rogues, these being Captain Cold, Heatwave, Mirror Master, Weather Wizard, and the Trickster. And then I'd have Linda Park, Iris West, Cisco Ramon, Harrison Wells, Kyle Rayner, Green Lantern in a cameo, Wally West, and Barry Allen in flashbacks. And with Cisco, Harrison, and Linda, now obviously Linda Park has a role as Wally's love interest, but with Cisco and Harrison, I would love to see the idea of Flash having like a team at Star Labs carry over into one of the Flash movies, which I think would be really cool. But let's go about the casting in 3 sections. So the first part will be dedicated to the Rogues, while the second will be for characters that don't need a lot of explanation, and then I'll go to the characters that I feel need more of an explanation. For Captain Cold, I've cast Andrew Lincoln. For Heatwave, I've cast Callan Mulvey. For Weather Wizard, I've cast Daniel Radcliffe. For Mirror Master, I've cast Rami Malek. And for the Trickster, I've cast Macaulay Culkin. Now, moving on to characters that don't need an explanation, for Linda Park, I've cast Melise Cho, who played the character on the TV show, and I thought she was pretty good there. That, and I had a crush on a character from Big Time Rush, so don't judge me. Okay, alright, moving on, for Cisco Ramon, I cast Avon Jogia from Victorious. I've seen that fan cast floating around for years now, and I think it's brilliant. For Harrison Wells, I've cast Aidan Gillian. I've seen him in some other stuff, and I thought he was really good. And in the cameo role for Kyle Rayner, I've cast Henry Zaga. This wouldn't be a huge role, but I could see him perhaps making an appearance in the Green Lantern movie, which could happen at some point, or the Green Lantern TV show that's being developed for the new DCU. And now we come to what I call the Big Three: Barry Allen, Wally West, and Iris West. Now, as mentioned, Barry will be seen in flashbacks, so he doesn't have to be that big a role in the movie. Now, we could easily cast Grant Gustin, but as I mentioned before, he needs a rest from the role, so instead I would have cast Lucas Till in the role. There's not really any explanation needed because he's the fancast favourite, and I think he'd do a pretty decent job. For Iris West, I've gone for Lily James, and while I've seen people fancast her as Lois Lane, I feel personally that she works better as Iris. And for Wally West, saving the best for last, I've cast KJ Apa from Riverdale as the character. Now, like Till, he is also the fancast favourite for the role, and I can see him in the Rebirth suit taking down the Rogues. I can picture that in my head. Okay, now I've got the cast and an outline for what this movie would have to do differently than other adaptations of the character. So without further ado, let's begin. So Act 1 will focus on setup, as in we'll set up Wally's arc for the story and whether he can be as good a Flash as Barry. On the other end of the spectrum, we'll see the Rogues playing some kind of scheme to steal some really expensive diamond of some kind, and at the end of this part of the story we'll see Wally defeated in a fight with the Rogues, proving he still needs to grow as a hero. Act 2 will then focus on Wally as he has doubts about taking over as the main Flash with Barry gone. In this part of the story we will introduce the Star Labs crew into the mix, and this will be how Wally meets Linda Park. The two were lovers in high school but kind of drifted apart following graduation, and after this Wally talks with Kyle Rayner and then with Iris, and here we would see a flashback about what happened to Barry, that when a particle accelerator went into meltdown, he attempted to limit the damage, but at the cost of his own life, and the energy that released from the resulting explosion then gave Wally West his powers. And finally, Act 3 will focus on Wally coming to terms with his own struggles, that he doesn't have to measure up to Barry, but he can be his own version of the hero, because no matter what happens, the world will always need heroes. And with the help of the Star Labs team, and a live-action variant of the Rebirth suit, Wally successfully defeats the Rogues and sends them away to prison.
We're doing a television series called Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is a story of paradise. Paradise Island, usually known as Themyscira, which is the birthplace of Wonder Woman. It's almost like Game of Thrones with Westeros, but with all of the inhabitants of Paradise Island.
Wonder Woman is another one of DC's iconic characters from its 85-year history. She was one of the first female heroes in comics, and she made a huge impact on the DCEU. Gal Gadot's version of Wonder Woman arguably is one of the better actor performances to come from that messy narrative, and her first solo outing, to put it plainly, was, in my opinion, one of the diamonds in a larger pile of coal. But what exactly would make a good Wonder Woman movie today for the new DC universe? Let's talk about it. Now, the DCEU, to put it plainly, is one of the biggest mixed bags in superhero cinema since Iron Man 3. Now, there are a lot of diamonds in that big pile of coal. Aquaman, Shazam, the Suicide Squad, and the first Wonder Woman are perfect examples of this. Movies that lean into the comic book feel of the character, like Gunn's Suicide Squad, or movies that have some incredible action, like Aquaman and the first Wonder Woman. Now, there are people out there who never liked Gal Gadot as Diana, and I can understand where some of those people come from. While her solo movie did well, the sequel, set in 1984, did horrendously, which is down to a few factors, with the most obvious being a global pandemic. But outside of that, her other performances were actually very welcome, with her cameos in Shazam 2 and The Flash being very welcome surprises for me. Now, Wonder Woman on her own is a powerful adversary. She's a warrior princess who's taken on some pretty large threats in the DC universe. She's fought the likes of Cheetah and Ares, but alongside the Justice League, has fought the likes of Brainiac, Darkseid and the Legion of Doom, and in many scenarios works better in an ensemble cast, with Zack Snyder's Justice League proving to be one such example. But if we're making a Wonder Woman movie for the DCU and then setting it in modern day, that might seem a bit bland. Which is why instead we need to make a Wonder Woman period movie, which basically means we'll set it in a different time frame. Now, given the 1980s weren't too kind to Diana in one of her solo films, we'll steer clear from that area for now, but I'm going to take a page from the first Wonder Woman movie, and by extension the first Captain America, and set this during a war, but instead of World War I, like the first film, I'm going to set this in World War II. Now, as we all know, a modern Justice League wasn't even around in World War II, and all the core members, bar Wonder Woman, weren't even born, and their ancestors were around during that time most likely. Which is why we need to look to a different team that predates them, and I think you all know where I'm going with this. The Justice Society of America, in my opinion, are a team that has been very overlooked in live action. The Arrowverse did some alright stuff with them, and Black Adam actually provided some potential for them. Had the DCEU continued, I would be willing to bet we would have gotten a Justice Society spin-off with more members from the comics. Now, arguably one of the only good things about Black Adam was the Justice Society. Aldous Hodge's Hawkman was brilliantly cast, and Pierce Brosnan's take on Kent Nelson was simply perfect for me. And I hope those two castings especially will carry over into the DCU, as it would be a shame to see such perfectly cast characters go to waste. So now we're making a Wonder Woman movie where Diana leads the Justice Society into battle during World War II. We need now a lineup of heroes, and because the Justice Society has been around for decades, we need a lineup that harkens back to the comics, and since it's changed over the years, this is the definitive lineup I would love to see. Dr. Fate, Stargirl, Hawkman, Wildcat, Jay Garrick, Red Tornado, and Stripe. For those who don't know, Stripe is a giant mech suit from the Stargirl TV show, but that mech does exist in the comics. Just go watch the Justice League animated show or go read some Stargirl comics. Now, I feel like a lineup of heroes like this can not only provide a lot of unique action, but these heroes can also act as further ways to expand the DCU. Jay Garrick, of course, is a part of the Flash family, plus Dr. Fate can act as a backdoor to the mystical corner of the DCU with John Constantine and Zatanna, who I hope eventually show up in the DCU at some point. But how would this work? Well, I think it's important to have the JSA already be an established team, as they deal with strange phenomena throughout the war at the request of the US government. The JSA could come across Diana when she makes her way back to Europe after saving Steve Trevor. So, now that we've talked about Diana, the villains, and the Justice Society, I think it's time we cast this movie. Now, because it seems like a tradition now after my other videos in this series, I'll start with the characters that don't need as much of an explanation, and then I'll get onto the characters that I think need more of one. So starting off with the Justice Society, for Dr. Fate I'm going to carry over Pierce Brosnan from Black Adam, and I'll do the same for Hawkman and carry over Aldous Hodge. For Jay Garrick I've cast Sam Rockwell, for the voice of Red Tornado I've cast Jeff Bennett, who I think would also do the mocap work for the character as well. For Ted Grant, aka Wildcat, I've cast Timothy Oliphant, and I'm going to carry over Breck Basinger from the TV show as Stargirl, because I feel like she was perfectly cast there. Moving on to the remaining characters, for Steve Trevor, I wanted someone who could emulate what Chris Pine did in the first Wonder Woman, which is why I cast Chase Crawford for the role. Now, you'll know Crawford for his role as an Aquaman parody in The Boys, but I've seen a few people fan cast him as Steve Trevor, and to me, he can give the stern but comedic portrayal that I think Steve needs in this movie. Now, casting Wonder Woman is going to be difficult because I find it all the more likely that Gal Gadot could be coaxed back to join the DCU, but let's say she decides not to. We'll need to find someone that can play Diana. Some people have suggested Ana de Armas, which I wouldn't be opposed to, as I could see her using her accent in the role. Kobe Smulders is a good shout, and nearly played Diana in a scrapped Wonder Woman movie by Joss Whedon, which probably wouldn't have been the best idea, and I think she turned down the role anyway. However, I think a very combat-heavy role like Wonder Woman needs an actress like Jamie Alexander, who to me is the definitive pick, much in the same way that people cast Jensen Ackles as Batman, or more recently David Corenswet as Superman. I can genuinely see these three making up the main DCU trilogy. But outside of that, many people have cast Jamie for Wonder Woman for some time now, with the main reason for that being her role as Lady Sif in the Thor movies, which I can completely understand. I've seen a lot of fan art of Jamie as Diana, and after seeing it, I can definitely see her in this role. Now, in terms of story for this, I wouldn't want to do anything too drastic. Act 1 would open with a flashback to Diana's origins, and we'd then cut to seeing the Justice Society in action on a World War II battlefield, aiding troops, and then we would see Steve Trevor on a mission to obtain files regarding a secret weapon the Axis powers have apparently discovered. Trevor manages to steal the files and makes a getaway in a stolen German plane, but he ends up having to fly over Themyscira, which gets him shot down by the Amazons. This is how Diana would meet Steve for the first time, and Steve would explain how the rest of the world are at war with a dangerous adversary, and Diana plans to help get Steve home and join the fight herself. She obtains her sword, the lasso of truth, and her iconic outfit, and this is what actually ends Act 1. Act 2 would see Diana and Steve make it back to America, and just in time as well, because the US Army is planning to storm Omaha Beach to help free France from Nazi control. Diana steps up to help, and Steve's general, who was initially opposed, eventually gives permission since the other quote-unquote superhumans are also planning to storm the beach themselves with the troops. We would then see Steve and Diana meet the Justice Society, with Diana actually knowing who Dr. Fate is, due to having heard legends about the Helm of Nabu when she was a child. The rest of Act 2 will see Diana, Steve and the Justice Society strategizing their attack with Stargirl, Dr. Fate, Stripe and Red Tornado, fighting the aerial threats, while the rest of the heroes fight on the ground. Diana believes this strategy will work, and so they all set out to join the troops storming Omaha Beach. And now we come to Act 3, which will focus solely on the Omaha Beach landings. The reason I chose D-Day as the film's climax is because I feel it would be very similar to the No Man's Land scene from the first Wonder Woman, where we would see Diana kicking ass on the battlefield, and the opening fight on Omaha Beach with her and the Justice Society is meant to evoke that. Anyway, the JSA makes it past enemy lines, and they all start destroying the Nazis' weaponry and discover that the Germans have been experimenting with atomic weaponry. Now, this is also a reference to the fact that the Germans were also working on atomic weaponry during World War II before the Americans perfected that tech. Thank you, Oppenheimer. And this bomb, while not as powerful as a nuke, has enough destructive force to destroy a major city, which would give the Germans the power they need to win the war. This proves to be Red Tornado's defining moment as a hero. He plans to use his ability to destroy the bomb before it can be used, but the resulting explosion would destroy him and this army base, which houses plans for more bombs like this to be built. After fighting off a majority of the troops, the JSA retreat while Red Tornado destroys the Nazi outpost, sacrificing himself to free the people of France from German oppression.
I will say that I think that now, after the success of Guardians and showing like the other side of the universe that what Marvel did, I think it opens the door also for Green Lantern to
This is a story of a couple of Green Lanterns, John Stewart and Hal Jordan, and we have a few other Lanterns peppered in there, but this is really a terrestrial-based TV show, which is almost like True Detective, with a couple of Green Lanterns who are space cops watching over Precinct Earth.
So Green Lantern is one of the many characters in DC's Last Rival that is yet to be given a proper live-action adaptation, and in what I consider the most difficult task of this ongoing series, I'm going to try my best to pitch a Green Lantern film that can expand into a trilogy, and maybe an HBO Max series. So let's talk about it.
In brightest day,
In blackest night,
shall escape my sight.
let those who worship evil's might
Beware
my power! Green Lantern's light!
Now, before we talk about anything, we first need to address the very large elephant in the room. 2011's Green Lantern movie with Ryan Reynolds. Now, I would argue this movie is a larger train wreck than Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, but I think that's up for a lot of debate in a future video. Now, while I could just berate this movie for the entire video, Ryan Reynolds has mocked this film plenty, so I'm gonna identify where this movie went wrong and the lessons we can learn from this and apply them when making a good Green Lantern movie. So the first thing is the decision to make the suits entirely CGI. Now, I get why this was done, seeing as willpower made up the construct of a Green Lantern, but do we really need a CGI suit as well? Like a completely CGI one? The second problem is that the villains, if you can really call them that, aren't necessarily that compelling to watch on screen. Sure, Mark Strong does a half-decent job as Sinestro, but that's because it's a slow transition to him becoming a Yellow Lantern. Another thing that bothered me was the decision to keep Hal on Earth for most of the movie, which does frustrate me. The whole point of the Green Lanterns are that they're meant to be an intergalactic police force, and are meant to be spread across the wider universe. So keeping Hal on Earth is kind of pointless, and it's like if Marvel decides to keep the Fantastic Four on Earth, which I hope, for the love of God, they don't do. That franchise is fucked up enough, thank you. However, from this movie there are lessons we can learn, with the obvious being to not go completely for CGI suits, but we also shouldn't go fully practical either. Going for something that meets in the middle should in theory work better on screen. And secondly, the villain or villains should be compelling. Green Lantern has some very well-known members of his rogues gallery like Sinestro, Atrocitus, Larfleeze, Parallax, and Necron the Black Lantern. Also, by keeping Hal on Earth, there's no look into the cosmic side of the universe outside of the Green Lantern's homeworld. The main selling point of the Green Lantern side of the DC universe is that they're meant to be the backdoor to the cosmic world, just like how Batman is the backdoor to the more grounded characters in the DCU. Now, despite the massive failure of the 2011 movie, there is one noteworthy Green Lantern movie that does a lot of things right that the live-action one didn't really do, and that is the movie Green Lantern First Flight, released in 2009. It's a story of how Hal is recruited by the Green Lantern Corps and how Sinestro eventually falls to the dark side. Here we can learn more about what a Green Lantern film needs and the visual style it would need to be successful. Now, in my opinion, DC, while having put out some great films over the past few decades, has had a better success rate with animation. In the 90s, I would argue they were the kings of television, with Batman the Animated Series, Superman, and of course Batman Beyond, which I have a separate video on if you want to go and check that out. Now supposedly, James Gunn's DCU is based on the DC animated universe that these shows came from, which I think is a pretty good model to start from, as most of the characters in that universe are already established without having to show their origin. We know where all these characters came from, and we don't need to focus on them for a whole episode of the series. Anyway, from this movie in particular, we learn that even though it's a movie that focuses on the cosmic, you don't have to go big with the ideas in the story. You can still do something like that, but on a smaller scale like The Mandalorian, and I'll get to that later on. Now, I think it would also be important to talk about what James Gunn has planned for the Green Lanterns in his DCU with Peter Safran. So Gunn has plans to incorporate an HBO series called Lanterns into the DCU, which will focus on Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart as Green Lanterns watching over Precinct Earth. James also compared the show to True Detective, and has also said the show will revolve around the discovery of a terrifying mystery, and while I previously speculated it could be Blackest Night, it is apparently an Earth-based mystery, and what that is remains to be seen. So after looking at the Green Lantern films and what Gunn has planned, what would in theory make a good Green Lantern film? Now, we can of course pitch a trilogy or even a saga, but the latter is a bit too much for me, so I'll stick to the trilogy model for now. So a trilogy, I feel, should document the rivalry that would unfold with Hal and Sinestro, and shows how Sinestro himself eventually becomes a Yellow Lantern. Now, hypothetically, film 1 would establish a lot of the major things, with these being the characters and the villains we would see, but my take on the Green Lantern story is going to be different, as we will open with Hal having been a Lantern for some time, and he's now experienced enough to tutor a new recruit to the Corps, Jessica Cruz. Now, Jessica Cruz is a more recent addition to the Green Lantern world, and I would love to see her included in the new DCU down the line. But the first movie would focus on Hal training Jessica, but with Sinestro's eventual downfall being the catalyst, which sets us off on the story to come. Now, when talking about Green Lantern, I think it would be interesting to pull from Star Wars for certain ideas and themes. Sure, we have a trilogy planned out, which is what we normally get from Star Wars every couple of years, but one place I want to take inspiration from in particular is The Mandalorian. One thing the show has done is expand the Star Wars universe in new ways that the movies couldn't achieve, excluding Rogue One, which I think did that fairly well. So I think a good idea would be to have an HBO Max series run concurrent with the trilogy. We can have other characters show up here that don't fit into the movies. Now, a lazy direction would be to set up conflicts for the trilogy, but a better use of the show alongside expanding the universe could be to explore the history of the Guardians. The history of the Lantern Corps is rich with detail, and this series can explore that. So we've talked about my plans for how to tackle Green Lantern, as well as looking at what the other movies did right and wrong, and the lessons we can learn from them. But I think it's time we look into who we would cast as these characters. Now, the one Lantern I won't be casting is Carl Rayner, as I've already mentioned him in my Flash video, which you can go and check out. But moving on, here are the Green Lantern characters I would plan on casting. Hal Jordan, Jon Stewart, Guy Gardner, Jessica Cruz, Sinestro, Kilowog, Atrocitus, Larfleeze, and Saint Walker. Now, some of these characters, more notably Saint Walker and Larfleeze, will be characters that appear in the HBO Max show, as opposed to the movies. But for those characters, I would cast Doug Jones as Saint Walker and David Tennant as Larfleeze. I don't really need to explain them because Superframe did that for me. But for Atrocitus, I'm going to cast Terry Crews, who has the physique for Atrocitus, which allows him to do the mocap work for the character as well as doing the voice. And for Kilowog, I'm going to cast Ving Rhames, who, like Crews, has the physique to do the mocap work as well as the character's voice. For Guy Gardner, I'm going to cast Sean William Scott, aka Stifler, who according to Superframe exudes Guy Gardner energy, and for Jon Stewart I'm also going to cast Sterling K. Brown, who I think deserves a lot more recognition in film and TV. For Jessica Cruz, I think it's important that we cast an actress of Latina descent, which is why I landed on Victoria Justice. Now hear me out, because I've been behind that idea for a while now, and I would love to see Victoria taking on a superhero role, seeing as she's not been well known for any acting work outside of Victorious. You may know I casted a Victorious actor in my Flash video. And now we come to Hal Jordan. I was torn between two actors, so I'm going to discuss them both here and try to decide which one fits the role better. Now, my first choice is Tom Cruise, because to me, he looks a lot like the character and he has played a fighter pilot before, see Top Gun Maverick. And my second choice is James Marsden, who after the Sonic movies I could see in more of a mentor role to Jessica Cruz. And while Marsden may be more of the fancast favourite, I would genuinely love to see what Tom Cruise could do as a character. Hate on the casting if you want, but I'd be at the very least curious to see his take on Hal Jordan. So when we're talking about pitching a trilogy, here's what I would do for those three films. So starting off with the first movie, this will focus on Hal training Jessica, and the story will see Sinestro attempt to coax Jessica into joining him. And halfway through Act 2, that does actually end up happening. but by the film's end we would see Jessica rejoin the Corps and the Guardians exiling Sinestro, which pushes him into joining the Yellow Lantern Corps, which is already established. Moving on to film 2, it would focus on Hal and Jess as a pairing of lanterns, with Jessica almost done with her training. This movie sees the Red Lanterns make their presence known to the galaxy after being absent for a long time, much like Palpatine, and they plan to assert their dominance in the world. While Jessica almost falls to the Corps, her willpower is stronger than ever, and she defeats the leader Atrocitus and tells him to stay in line or feel the wrath of the Guardians. And now we come to film 3, where we see Sinestro exact his revenge on the Guardians for his exile, as he and the Orange Lanterns enslave the entirety of the Green Lantern Corps, destroying their rings, preventing them from using their power, and kind of putting a dampener on the battery. Hal and Jess make it back to Earth, where they plan on recruiting someone else to join the fight. Hal and Jess recruit Carl Rayner, who's been on Earth for a while, not really assuming his Green Lantern duties. But after meeting with Jon Stewart and Guy Gardner, both of whom managed to escape Oa, the group plan to launch an attack on the Yellow Lantern Corps and take back their homeworld. The Lanterns free the Guardians and reconstruct the rings for the Lanterns to fight, and the final conflict would be Hal versus Sinestro as the two engage in one of the larger action set pieces for the third movie. Sinestro gravely injures Hal, and so Jessica is forced to step in. With her willpower being stronger than the last time they met, Jessica is easily able to take on Sinestro with ease, and she manages to depower him. And while he doesn't die, Hal instead decides to retire as a Green Lantern and passes his mantle as the Green Lantern of Earth to Jessica, as she's earned it and deserved to call herself a Green Lantern. This would end with Sinestro being locked up in a high-security prison, with Quad losing their Green Lantern powers and their power battery being permanently destroyed, with the galaxy now living in relative peace, with the Green Lantern acting as the outer space police force we know them as in the comics. Moving on to the HBO Max show, as mentioned, this would expand the cosmic side of the DCU, with various lanterns like Jon Stewart and Guy Gardner protecting the galaxy. This show would also serve another purpose, that being to act as somewhere to explore the history of the Guardians. Now, the lead Green Lantern role for this show can go to Jon Stewart as he explores the galaxy and attempts to stop the scum and villainy, which may very well be his speciality, and then we can see new worlds from this universe and expand on characters previously seen in the films. There's also an added advantage of seeing other villains in the series. We can see Jon Stewart going up against the other evil lanterns like Laughley's, or fighting off Parallax's demonic possession. So essentially this would focus on Jon Stewart's adventures, with other members of the Corps like Guy Gardner and Carl Rayner tagging in on the adventures. So before we get into the important stuff, I first need to take you through the timeline of events that leads us to this movie. The first film in this quote-unquote saga will be Superman Legacy, quite fitting seeing as it will be the first movie in James Gunn's DC universe. We then follow up with Brave and the Bold, which introduces audiences to a new Batman and to the more grounded part of this universe. We then head into the wider universe with the first Green Lantern movie, playing the role of the first Thor film by introducing us to the cosmic side of this universe, with Hal Jordan training Jessica Cruz Cruz, and we see Sinestro's Fall to Darkness. Following that, we head to Central City with the introduction of The Flash and Wally West stepping up to the plate with his first major victory, being the defeat of the Rogues. And Kyle Rayner's cameo in this movie will act as the back door for our Green Lantern HBO Max series, with Jon Stewart as he explores the universe with other lanterns popping up in certain episodes. Then we jump into World War II with the first Wonder Woman, where we see her fight the Nazis on Omaha Beach with Steve Trevor and the Justice Society. This film will teach Diana about leadership, which is quite fitting for her role in this movie. After Wonder Woman, we will return to Batman with his sequel, Death of the Family, which dives into the rivalry of Batman and the Joker, who returns to Gotham having cut off his face in Arkham Asylum. The end of this movie will see Joker fall off the cliff like he does in the comic, only to return in the third Batman movie, but I will be saving that for Phase 2. After a terrifying ordeal for the Bat family, we once again return to the cosmic with our second Green Lantern film, where it sees Hal and Jessica face off against Atrocitus, with Jess herself tempted by the Red Lantern Core of Rage, but her willpower will shine through, and in a similar parallel to Star Wars, she returns to the light side and defeats Atrocitus. The end of this movie would see Hal assign Jessica as the Green Lantern of Sector 2814, otherwise known as Earth in the comics of course. So if you haven't picked up on that, Jessica Cruz, at least for this movie, will be the Green Lantern for the Justice League. So moving on to the lineup for my version of the JLA, we will of course have the trinity of Batman, Superman and Wonder Woman, and I've already mentioned Jessica Cruz. This movie will also see Bruce recruiting Wally West in a similar vein to how the Justice League movie handled it, so I thought that was a nice touch. But that leaves us with 5 members of the team. So what about other members? Well, that's a major plot point of this movie, because the story focuses on the introduction of John Johns and Kendra Saunders, otherwise known as Hawkgirl and Martian Manhunter.
Now I've heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. But you don't really care for music, do you?
So before we get into the story, the villains and the cast, we first need to discuss one very important thing, and that is the Snyder Cut. While I would discuss the theatrical cut of Justice League, it's terrible and we all know it, so I don't really want to beat that opinion like a dead horse. But moving on, this cut of Justice League restores Zack Snyder's true vision for the movie and how this would have set up a majority of the DCEU projects. These would have included Man of Steel 2, the Green Lantern Corps series, and of course Ben Affleck's cancelled Batman movie, with Justice League 2 also having been hinted at in that story. Another reason I mentioned the Snyder Cut is because my Justice League movie will serve a similar purpose, to set up more of the DCU, with this movie acting as a springboard for future films and shows while also telling its own story. But as mentioned, I'll be saving those for the next video where I talk about Phase 2 and the projects involved there. Now, the Justice League has been around for decades and have, over the years, collected several villains: Darkseid, Lex Luthor, Brainiac, and of course the Legion of Doom, which is basically a collection of all their rogues. But for this movie, the villain will be Vandal Savage. Now, we've seen this particular villain popping up here and there. The only live-action portrayal of him was in the Arrowverse in the Flash and Arrow's second crossover, where he then became the antagonist for Legends of Tomorrow Season 1. Now, Savage has the same motivations from the crossover, where he's trying to seek out Kendra for his own nefarious means. I went with Vandal Savage because when we do get a Justice League movie in the new DCU, I worry we'll get one of the common JLA villains like Lex Luthor or Darkseid, and I hope they don't go in that direction because there are loads of villains out there who can be used in new and exciting ways, with Vandal Savage, in my opinion, being one of them. Now, if you've been keeping up with previous entries in the series, then you already know a majority of the castings I planned out for this, so you'll know who I've cast for a majority of the roster. But to recap, for Bruce Wayne I cast Jensen Ackles because that casting is perfect. For Superman, I just went with David Corenswet because he was already cast prior to that video. I cast KJ Apa as Wally West, Jamie Alexander as Diana Prince, and Victoria Justice as Jessica Cruz. Again, all cast in separate videos, so you can go check those out. But with these 5 already cast, that leaves us with Martian Manhunter, Hawkgirl and Vandal Savage, who will be this movie's main antagonist. Now for Martian Manhunter, I believe that when he does make the jump to the DCU, I think he will be brought to life in a similar way to The Vision, wherein we have an actor on set with some prosthetics, but then he's further augmented via CGI in post-production. I think that could work really well. But for the actor, I'm very tempted to bring in Harry Lennox, who played the character in Snyder's Justice League, but the more I think about it, he's a little too old for the version of John John's Ivan Vision. So for Martian Manhunter, I've landed on Chukwudi Iwuji, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, who's worked with James Gunn before on Peacemaker and more recently Guardians of the Galaxy 3, where in my opinion he played one of the best MCU villains. I have a review of that movie if you want to go watch it, even though it's been several months since the movie released. Now for Hawkgirl, the heavy lifting has thankfully been done for me here, and as Isabella Merced, known for roles in Instant Family, Sicario 2 and Transformers The Last Night, has been cast as Hawkgirl. Now I think this is a pretty solid choice. Isabella is a great actress by all accounts, and having seen her alongside Jason Momoa in the film Sweet Girl, which is on Netflix, great watch, I think she could nail the role of Kendra Saunders, or Shiara Hall, which she'll be going by in this movie. And now we come to the casting for Vandal Savage, which is going to prove tricky. Now we could very easily carry over Casper Crump, who played Savage in the Arrowverse, but it's important that we have a fresh face that hasn't played the character before, and for that reason I've landed on Numan Akar, who you'll know for roles in Prison Break, Spider-Man Far From Home, and his role in 2019's Aladdin movie where he played Hakim. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, apologies. Now, I'm sure there are other actors out there who could play Vandal Savage, but I've gone with Newman for now, unless James Gunn decides to cast the character for his universe down the line, rendering this very much useless. So now we have our cast, our lineup for the league, and of course our villain. Let's dive into the story I've planned for this movie. So, the plot for this Justice League movie will loosely follow the story of the Season 2 crossover with The Flash titled Legends of Today and Legends of Yesterday, where Vandal Savage is hunting down Shiara due to their shared history. You'll know this if you either know Hawkgirl's personal history in the comics or you've watched that specific crossover. Anyway, the movie will open with Kendra living in Gotham City, where she's attacked by Vandal Savage and rescued by Batman. After running some facial recognition, Bruce discovers that Kendra exists throughout history, possibly going back to Egyptian times. Bruce does ask Kendra if she knows who the man was that attacked her, but Kendra is clueless, she's never seen this man before today. This eventually comes to the attention of John Jones, a detective in the Gotham City Police Department. Him and Bruce have crossed paths prior to this, but they never really had a proper interaction. Jones talks to Kendra on his own and using his hidden powers discovers that she is a reincarnation of the Egyptian princess Shiara, and that she was killed by Savage and reincarnated. John shares this with Batman and the two agree to work together, but if Vandal Savage is as deadly opponent as they've seen, they're gonna need to recruit a team. Now this is where we would see the heroes at work. Superman is locked in a battle with Parasite. In Coast City we see Jessica Cruz aiding in a rescue operation with a collapsing bridge, using her willpower constructs to save people. In Central City we'll see Wally West foiling a bank robbery, while in Washington DC we'll see Diana in a Congress meeting, acting as a liaison between the UN and Themyscira, of course, her home. The next part of the movie will see two stories unfold, the first one being Bruce looking into Vandal Savage and looking for answers, with the other being John recruiting members of the League, whilst Bruce does go to Central City as he already knows of the Scarlet Speedster and is surprised to see Wally West as opposed to Barry Allen. And these heroes are then brought to the Batcave where Wally West naturally freaks out because, well, it's Batman, what do you expect? Bruce introduces the hero to Shiara and explains what they're up against. Through some contact with Malcolm Merlyn, who is a former member of the League of Assassins, Bruce has found out that Vandal Savage is an immortal, which does freak out Shiara and she tries to leave, but is stopped by Diana, who comforts the young girl saying they'll stop this guy. Just then, Savage shows up in the Batcave, which stuns Bruce due to the Batcave's high security level. Batman and Diana fight Savage, which forces him to retreat, as both of them are very deadly combatants in the comics. The next part of the story will see Bruce getting to know the heroes, as in this story, he and Hawkgirl will be the focal points. Eventually, Bruce has gotten to know the heroes and who they really are, and now trusts them quite a bit. I would also throw in some scenes with Diana, Jessica and Shiara training together and forming a very close bond, as they're the only three women on the team. We then cut to Savage, who finds himself in Japan, meeting with the League of Assassins following Ra's al Ghul's death in Brave and the Bold. Shiara then spends time getting to know the other members of the League, sharing a bond with Wally in particular, as I imagine these two being close in age to each other, at least in this movie. Eventually, the League is trained up and ready to fight Vandal, who somehow managed to gather some of Ra's al Ghul's best men to aid him in the fight. This is where we can utilise the JLA's powers in unique ways by giving each of them their own dedicated fight scene. Batman using his own training against the assassins, Clark using his strength and powers to overwhelm a few of them, Diana just making her way through the majority of the soldiers because she's an Amazonian warrior princess, Martian Manhunter using his own abilities to his own advantage, with Wily and Jessica also using their powers in unique and exciting ways. Shayara, however, has made her way to Savage, and the two are locked in a very fierce battle. This fight eventually makes its way down to a standstill because even if she wanted to, Shayara can't kill Vandal due to his immortality. Savage uses this to his advantage and using the Staff of Horus, which he's kept on since he first killed Shayara in Egyptian times, to obliterate the remaining heroes, but Wily sees this and starts running as the other League members are incinerated. Now you can probably tell where I'm going here, but this is where we would see Wily travel back in time to stop Savage before he can use the weapon. This moment in my version of the film serves two purposes, the first being a callback to Snyder's Justice League with the time travel scene in that movie, and a reference to the JLA animated series wherein Wily West will use the infinite mass punch to defeat Brainiac, who merged with Lex Luthor, and he pulls the same move here and it's successful as Wily defeats Savage, and the League are now trying to find a way to contain him, so they imprison Savage on an island in the North China Sea, Lian Yu, and this acts as a tease for Green Arrow, and I will get to that in Phase 2. After this, Bruce proposes that all of them form a team to stop threats like Vandal Savage from arising again, so the 7 heroes agree to form a league. A Justice League. That wasn't as dramatic as I thought it would be. Now, regarding post-credit scenes, we can have a tease to Green Arrow, who I hope shows up in the DCU one day, and the second we'll see Bruce coming up with contingency plans for each member of the team, which could one day come back to bite him in the ass. I'm very certain that's going to happen. So, Phase 2 is going to open with a sequel to Superman, which I'll be calling Superman, Son of Krypton, and sees General Zod return from the Phantom Zone and plans to exact revenge on the son of the man who imprisoned him. This will dive deeper into Krypton's history outside of what we would see in my version of Legacy. Now, Clark will defeat Zod but will lose his dad in the fight, with Jonathan Kent dying of a heart attack, which leads Clark to believe he can't save everyone. Then we wrap up the Green Lantern trilogy with Fear in Yellow. We see Sinestro and the Yellow Lanterns enslave Oa, and it comes down to the remaining Lanterns of Hal, Jess, Guy, Kyle and John to save the Corps and defeat Sinestro. They win, with Sinestro himself being imprisoned on Oa and the Yellow Lantern Corps themselves being forcibly disbanded. It's after this that we then head back to Gotham with Batman's third movie titled White Knight, which will combine both White Knight and the Endgame comic storylines. Following Joker's disappearance and death of the family, we see that Bruce has become more violent with criminals, but then Joker, now known once more as Jack Napier, returns having quote-unquote fixed his mental stability, and it eventually comes down to Batman fighting Joker in the catacombs underneath Arkham Asylum. Joker taunts Batman with the idea of killing him, but Bruce realises that this has been a sick game to the Joker and refuses to kill him, vowing never to break his code. The caves collapse in as Joker is killed for good, and Bruce decides to focus on funding the Justice League as a distraction, and leaves Gotham in the capable hands of the Bat family. We then move back to the Flash in his sequel titled Gorilla City, when Flash and the Star Labs crew set out to find a team of missing scientists, but come across a group of intelligent gorillas led by Grodd. This eventually leads to Cisco's own dormant mess-human powers manifesting themselves as he takes on the mantle of Vibe to help aid Wally West in defeating Grodd and his gorilla army. With the League all preoccupied, it's time to introduce some new heroes into the story, and I'll start with Green Arrow. This HBO Max series will be an extended version of the Green Arrow Showcase animation, with Oliver attempting to save the heir of an Eastern European country from Count Vertigo, and Malcolm Merlyn perhaps is thrown into the mix as well. The end of this series would see Bruce approach Oliver and Black Canary, offering the both of them spots to join the Justice League, because that team itself is now expanding. But with Bruce devoting his time to expanding the League, what does this mean for the Bat family? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that is what the HBO Max series Gotham Knights will focus on. With Batman otherwise occupied with the JLA, he leaves Gotham in the care of Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, Damian Wayne and Barbara Gordon, with Tim Drake currently elsewhere leading the Teen Titans. With Batman's absence, a lot of the rogues come out to play, including Harley Quinn, Two-Face and Penguin as well. This series would also see Ra's al Ghul return after his death in Brave and the Bold, because Lazarus Pit. as he seeks revenge against Bruce and the Bat family. While the Batcave is vacated, Ra's sends Malcolm Merlyn to hack into the Batcomputer, where he discovers that Bruce has contingency plans for every current member of the Justice League, and so he sends these to Ra's, who begins his ultimate plan for revenge. Moving back to new heroes, we then head to the Teen Titans with their own HBO Max series, which will show what Tim Drake was up to during the events of Gotham Knights, as he and the Titans deal with the demon Trigon. Now, Trigon, being a demon from hell, is a very formidable opponent for the Titans, which is why they call upon John Constantine to assist them in taking down the demon, given that he has a lot of experience with the occult. And now we come to Justice League 2, and if you haven't picked up any of the hints over this video and my Justice League pitch, this movie will be adapting the Tower of Babel storyline from the comics. Now, for those who haven't read Tower of Babel or seen its animated adaptation titled Justice League Doom, the story in question sees Batman's contingency plans for the Justice League fall into the hands of the bad guys, and we know from the Justice League post-credit scene that Batman has been working on contingencies for these heroes. Now, more specifically for my version of the story, Ra's al Ghul has recruited various rogues from across the many cities to aid in his plan. These include Metallo, Mirror Master, Cheetah, who Diana met in between films, and Deathstroke as well, who survived the events of Brave and the Bold. When these plans are used by Ra's, Batman is horrified and sets out to save the heroes, because he's the one who created the contingencies and knows how to stop them. Now, Batman does succeed in saving the heroes, but as a result, a majority of the League has been left inactive due to their injuries from these plans. With the main roster now recovering, Batman is forced to recruit a B team to help him defeat Ra's and secure the contingency plans. And with all the heroes that we've seen across the past few films, I think Batman's got a fair amount of heroes he can contact. And with that, Bruce recruits Green Arrow, Black Canary, Cisco Ramon, Aquaman and Guy Gardner into his B team to help defeat Ra's and the Legion of Doom. So Bruce and this B team heads to the League's headquarters in Nanda Parbat after Raz's own temple was destroyed in Brave and the Bold. And this is where Bruce discovers that Raz has formed his own version of the Legion of Doom, with the villains he used to defeat the other heroes. After a bloody battle which sees Metallo almost dismantled, it comes down to a final duel between Batman and Raz almost wins the duel himself, but before he can deliver the killing blow, he's struck from behind by his own daughter, Talia, who we met in Brave and the Bold. Now, Talia has realised her father was truly evil, and only cared about how much power he had. She agrees to take charge of the League itself and keep them away from Gotham for good, kind of mirroring what happened in Batman Arkham Knight in the Season of Infamy DLC. It's here where we would then cut to a few weeks later, with the core members of the League now fully recovered. Batman explains why he created these contingency plans, that if any of them ever went rogue, then the other members would have to be ready for that very eventuality. Diana, who's put her trust in mankind since bridging Themyscira with the rest of the world, feels betrayed by someone she considered a friend, and the others all feel the same except for Superman, who kind of remains neutral to the situation. The League, minus Superman, vote to remove Batman from the team. Before they can do that, however, Bruce decides to leave off his own accord. With Bruce leaving the JLA, he also decides to pull his funding as well, but allows the Watchtower to be kept operational. Eventually, the whole League falls apart in the wake of Batman's betrayal, leaving only Diana and Martian Manhunter as the remaining original members of the team. However, they decide to bring in Batman's own B team as the new Justice League, with Diana acting as the leader and John acting as the mission coordinator. So I'm going to start off with the second film in Wonder Woman's trilogy. In a similar manner to Temple of Doom, this movie will be a prequel, set prior to the events of the first movie when Diana's faced with a trial by fire when Ares stages a conquest on her home, Themyscira. This essentially acts as Diana's origin story in this universe, as the conflict with Ares begins to make her understand what it means to be a warrior and a hero to her people. This is very much a full-on war movie, with Diana trying to defeat Ares before he can conquer all of Themyscira and make his presence known to the rest of the wider world. It all comes to a head in the final battle when Diana gets the upper hand in this final conflict and manages to get the killing blow in on Ares, winning the conflict and saving her home. And this will also directly set up the first Wonder Woman film, which you saw in Phase 1, with the post-credit scene, or this film better yet ending with Steve Trevor's plane crash landing on the ocean side of the island, more or less. And that brings us to Gotham with the second season of Gotham Knights. Now, as a quick refresher for those who are just tuning into this series, in the second Justice League movie, Tower of Babel, we saw Batman quit the team after his contingency plans fell into the arms of the bad guys, and as a result he has returned to Gotham to solely put his focus on the city. But this turns out to be his undoing, as upon his return to the Batcave one night, Bruce is attacked by Deathstroke, and the two engage in a brutal fight which ends with both of them dying as the Batcave is destroyed, and in the aftermath Bruce's identity as Batman is publicly revealed to the world. This leaves the Bat family in shock as they now come to terms with a Gotham that doesn't have a Batman to protect it. With Tim still occupied leading the Titans, this leaves Nightwing, Robin, Batgirl and Red Hood to solve the mystery of Batman's death, which then leads them to the Court of Owls. Now, the court were responsible for sending Deathstroke after Batman and knew this would be the final fight for the both of them. Now, the series initially starts out as a detective story as the Bat family attempt to figure out how Bruce was killed and why Deathstroke would go after him like this. With the Batcave and Wayne Manor destroyed, the now dubbed quote-unquote Gotham Knights take up refuge in the Belfry, an off-the-books hidden base that Bruce kept for emergencies only. The Knights, including Alfred, who was out of the manor at the time, take up refuge here and in the penultimate episode would discover the true conspiracy surrounding Bruce's death. At the end, the main leaders of the court are murdered by Jason, and the Knights agree to put aside their own differences and defend Gotham in Bruce's honour, with none of them taking on the Batman mantle, just agreeing to act as equal heroes protecting the city. And Alfred also finally decides to retire and he leaves Gotham to return to England. And now we move on to Season 2 of Green Arrow. This season is going to introduce John Diggle as a new member of Team Arrow, with Roy Harper also having joined the group in between seasons. So this means that we do have a Team Arrow in my DCU. Now, Season 2 will establish further links to the universe by revealing that Oliver's training actually came from the League of Assassins, which explains how he and Malcolm Merlyn knew each other, as during his stay on the island of Liang Yu, Oliver was Malcolm's student. Now, it transpires in present-day events, from the perspective of Team Arrow, that Malcolm has come out of retirement because the League of Assassins have all been wiped out, including Talia herself, which can also warrant a cameo from one or two members of the Bat family. Now, this series would see Oliver and Team Arrow form an uneasy alliance with Malcolm to investigate who was responsible for wiping out the League. Eventually, Oliver discovers it to be the Ninth Circle, formerly a part of the Court of Owls who split from the group for their own nefarious agendas, and it's revealed in flashbacks that Oliver's own parents, Robert and Moira, were in fact members of this group. And another reveal shows that Robert and Moira had left the Ninth Circle, and the higher-ups, not wanting to have their existence known, sabotaged the Queen's Gambit, which in turn made Oliver who he is today. Now, the end of the season would see the Ninth Circle leaders wiped out, with Merlyn sacrificing his own life to save them. Team Arrow then continues to operate in Star City, and Oliver decides to step into the light as he takes charge of Queen Consolidated and forges a strong alliance with Star City and promises to continue his parents' legacy. And now we cap off our Flash trilogy with the third and final chapter of Wally West's story as the Scarlet Speedster. Now, the villain for this movie will be Daniel West as the Reverse Flash. Whilst I do love Eobard Thawne and would love to see Anthony Starr from The Boys bring him to life, he works as the arch nemesis for Barry as the Flash. While I am aware that Wally and Eobard have faced off in the comics, I would rather see a different take on the Reverse Flash in live action, since we've already seen Eobard in the TV show, which is why for this I would go for Daniel's Reverse Flash, who we actually get to see on screen. He's only been seen in the New 52 comics, so yeah, I would want to bring him to life on the big screen for Wally as the Flash. Now, this movie would also see the reveal that Barry Allen is in fact alive and well, and has been keeping the Speed Force alive all this time, and after an intense battle, both Wally and Barry team up to take down Daniel, who is imprisoned in the Speed Force as the new battery in place of Barry. It's a fate worse than death, but what can I tell you? Now, despite being freed from the Speed Force, Barry has no desire to return to his life as a superhero, and decides to settle down with Iris, the two finally getting married at the film's conclusion, with Wally leading the Star Labs crew as the one and only Flash. And next up we come to Wonder Woman 3, which will focus on Diana as the new leader of the Justice League. Now, as a recap here, the original JLA lineup, which consisted of Superman, Martian Manhunter, The Flash, you can go watch the video. That lineup fell apart in the aftermath of Batman's betrayal, and in order to combat Ra's, Bruce formed a new reserve team of heroes. This team, combined with Diana and Martian Manhunter, have now become the new Justice League, dubbed the Justice League International, and they currently assist with major incidents and natural disasters. Regarding storylines, this film will see the US government attempt to rein in the League with Batman dead and the former members no longer involved, as the leader of this movement against the JL International is none other than Maxwell Lord. Now, this movie would see Maxwell Lord purchase the rights to the Watchtower, making him the de facto benefactor of the League. Oliver, who's had his fair share of run-ins with rich people, is skeptical of Lord's intentions, and he's right to be cautious as it then transpires that Maxwell Lord wants to franchise the League and create superhero teams for the entire world, with the starting point being the JL International and the secret agenda being Maxwell Lord wants to control and influence the higher powers. Diana and the team break into Lord's building, and after getting into the science labs of Max's company, Diana and Oliver discover that Max has somehow been able to reconstruct Red Tornado, previously seen with the Justice Society in World War II on the shores of Omaha Beach. Diana remembers Red Tornado's sacrifice, but the League is interrupted when Max shows up and says he now has the authority to disband the team now that they've broken into his company. However, Cisco has managed to copy all of Lord's plans onto a hard drive and the League is able to escape. With the Watchtower itself unsafe, Oliver and Cisco head to Gotham for the assistance of the Bat family in exposing Maxwell Lord's plans. This eventually works and Lord's plans are then exposed to the world. Eventually it comes down to a battle of the JLI and Red Tornado against Maxwell Lord and his army of androids. Another point I want to bring up in this film is that Max, by examining the remains of Red Tornado, has successfully managed to copy the cybernetics and create an army of android robots. Eventually the robots themselves are defeated and Max is incapacitated and sent to prison for his crimes. Now, Max's company Lord Tech is then brought out by Queen Consolidated and the team continues to operate, now with the backing of Oliver, who's essentially taken Bruce's role as the main source of funding. And the first major change is that Oliver funds the construction of the Hall of Justice to act as a new HQ, which leads to the Watchtower itself being decommissioned. Now, with the Justice League reassembled, or at least a version of them currently active, it's now time to focus on a new corner of this world, and that would be the supernatural. Now, the first of these is an HBO Max series focused on John Constantine, who I hope shows up in Gunn's DCU at some point, as he begins to suspect that Lucifer has a presence on Earth. Now, I know Trigon is technically the devil in the comics, but this is my way of incorporating some of the characters from the Lucifer show into the DCU. The story takes John to Los Angeles, where the presence of the devil is in fact the strongest, and he discovers that this Lucifer is in fact from a parallel universe, where he gave up ruling hell and decided to take a vacation to Los Angeles, only to end up in this universe through some unknown means. With Lucifer also in this world, this also ends up dragging a couple of the characters from his world into it. This includes Chloe Decker, Ella Lopez, Dan Espinosa, and Maze from that world as well. But yeah, essentially it's a supernatural buddy cop show as Constantine teams up with Lucifer and his friends at the LAPD to solve the case. It eventually transpires that Lucifer and his friends were brought here as part of some sort of prophecy, although the prophecy itself has been carved in an old language. Whilst Lucifer returns to working with the LAPD and his friends for the time being, John decides to take the prophecy and decipher it. The events of Constantine Hell on Earth then bring us to the events of Justice League Dark, where it sees John himself build his own Justice League to help defend against whatever threat this prophecy has predicted, and also to focus on any supernatural threats to this world. John travels to all the corners of the DC universe and eventually manages to recruit a few quote-unquote supernatural heroes to his cause. These include Boston Brand, aka Deadman, Zatanna Zatara, Swamp Thing, John Stewart Green Lantern, and yeah, that's pretty much it. I did want to put Dr. Fate in here, but he's retired, at least in this universe. The group teams up to take on Dr. June Moon, aka Enchantress, who seeks to use her magic on the rest of the world, but the team is able to overpower and defeat her. We can also establish that Constantine gives John Stewart the prophecy he discovered, with the Green Lantern discovering this is somewhat in line with the prophecy he once heard on Oa, the home planet of the Green Lanterns. This film would end with both Constantine and John theorizing that a great evil is in fact on the way. So, moving back to Superman and the final part of his trilogy, this movie will finally see Lex Luthor become a villain. Now, I want to establish that Lex has been in the shadows planning to get rid of Superman for his own nefarious agendas, and so hatches a plan. Using some teleportation tech he was able to reverse engineer from the Watchtower being decommissioned, he lures Superman into a trap, sending the Man of Steel to Warworld, where he faces off against Mongul. Clark is able to fight off the gladiators and manages to return to Earth several months later, and discovers that Luthor has become the President of the United States. Through some investigative journalism, Lois is able to expose Luthor's criminal activities, and he is immediately removed from office. In the aftermath, Lex dons his power armor and tries to kill Superman in one final act of revenge, which fails and ends with Lex being sent to prison on Stryker's Island. Clark and Lois then get married at the end of the film, with a hint towards Lois in fact being pregnant with baby Jonathan, aka Superboy. And now we come to Season 2 of Green Lantern. Now, this show is integral to the final part of this universe, serving as the quote-unquote Thor Ragnarok of this phase, that being it ties directly into the big team-up movie. This show will in fact see the re-emergence of Volthoom, the first being in the entire universe to ever wield a lantern ring, and he brings with him Krona, the Guardian who first harnessed the power of will into a glove, and became corrupted with power which led to his exile. With Hal retired, Carl and Guy both occupied on other missions, and Jessica defending Earth as its Green Lantern, John begrudgingly works with Sinestro, who knows a lot of the Guardian's history, and is the prime candidate to help take on Volthoom and Krona. It eventually comes down to a big fight between Volthoom and Krona versus the entire Green Lantern Corps. Krona is killed by Kyle, but reveals the true purpose of Volthoom. Now, Sinestro is about to kill the first being to ever wield a lantern ring, but Carl stops him and reveals the true purpose of Volthoom, that he serves as the lock and key to the cage holding Necron and Blackhand. Sinestro ignores these warnings and kills Volthoom, snapping his neck. The Lanterns restrain Sinestro and put him back in his cell on Oa, whilst John and the remaining human Lanterns of Jess, Carl and Guy meet up to discuss their next move. However, they are unable to come up with a fast plan, as Oa is shrouded in darkness. The Blackest Night has arrived. And we have finally arrived at the final Justice League movie and the final part of Phase 3, Blackest Night. This movie sees all the remaining DC heroes, including the previously retired Barry and Hal, team up to take on the newly revived Black Lantern Corps, with Necron having resurrected the previously dead heroes and villains as his soldiers in this war, with Black Hand leading the charge. The conflict is brutal, with Barry being killed by the resurrected Batman. The Black Lanterns are on the verge of bringing death to the entire universe, and Wily is able to escape into the Speed Force, with Constantine being able to tag along because, what do you expect, he's magic. Anyway, Wily and John end up in the Void as they witness the Black Lanterns overpower the remaining heroes and killing all life on Earth. Wily is distraught and tells John they had to do something, but John says there's only one thing they possibly could do: wipe the slate clean. Wily realises that John is talking about another Flashpoint, and we discover that this timeline is the result of Barry Allen fixing his own mistakes. And Wily is able to see the results of the Flashpoint timeline, where Thomas Wayne's Batman and Zod's forces took over the world, and Eobard Thawne attempted to kill his archenemy. It was only with the help of Thomas that Barry could escape, and that resulted in the creation of this new timeline. Now, Wily is left with no other choice. He goes back to the very night he gained his powers and stops the destruction of the particle accelerator, determined by John as the event that set this timeline into motion. Now, Wily stops the explosion at the cost of his own life and erasure from the timeline. However, Barry feels a disturbance in the Speed Force once this timeline is remade and comes across Wily managing to rescue him, and we discover what changed. The timeline has been corrected in the way that successfully prevented the death of the universe in Blackest Night, with some exposition dialogue revealing that in this timeline, Sinestro had been prevented from killing Volthoom and was imprisoned in his cell back on Oa, with Krona and the First Lantern both being placed in a prison at the edge of the universe. We then see Wily join the Titans as another shot sees Barry and this world's Justice League defending the world as the screen fades to black. And with that, we've reached the conclusion of my DC universe. After a lot of blood, sweat and tears, I have finally been able to deliver to you guys my own and ideal take on the DC lore and its characters. If you guys enjoyed this video and want to see me do another universe pitch for another franchise, then be sure to let me know in the comments. I would love to do another one. In the meantime, be sure to like, comment and subscribe for more videos. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you all soon.